Last December, shortly after I returned to New York from Washington, I offered to take services at a tiny parish in the Bronx, which was a great joy. And I knew that it was the last day of a special exhibit at the cloisters, an exhibit some of you may have gotten to. It was the Spemmen Allium in the Romanesque chapel of the cloisters, that large Romanesque chapel. So the Tallis 40-part motet. Speakers were surrounding the chapel so that the 40 parts could be heard as they made their way in and around. Some of you may have had the joy and pleasure of hearing that in a live performance. But this was in the chapel with speakers. And I made it there that last day after being with this faithful group, a faithful small flock. And I was surprised at how crowded it was. I thought it might be a little crowded, but it was hugely crowded. I had to wait for two 22-minute renditions of the Spemmen Allium to complete before my surge of the crowd was allowed into the chapel, and it was well worth it. So there we stood packed in the middle of this Romanesque grand chapel, the speakers outside and around us, and we listened as the parts ebbed and flowed. The first thing that struck me was how young the crowd was. How young they were. And it was a Sunday. And here they were in a 12th century church, albeit the cloisters. The other thing that struck me was the large Romanesque crucifix that comes down, hangs down from the front of the altar. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece of art, and also a beautiful piece of theology. And so I kept glancing up at this cross, and I kept glancing down and around at the group, mostly of young people around me, and noticed that their eyes were almost all closed. It was haunting. I stayed for a second rendition. It was like hanging out in the back of the movie theater while the new crowd comes in. I managed to stay. The usher didn't chase me away. And it was the same thing. A young crowd, eyes closed, beautiful Christ looking down in this Romanesque chapel. Having come from a small congregation in the morning and then experiencing this pseudo-congregation in the afternoon, I was struck that here we were in the setting, everything was laid out, there was an altar, there was a lectern, there was a Romanesque crucifix, there was a congregation, there was music, but our purpose was not to worship. And so it seemed to me, although a wonderful, wonderful piece of music performed well, a purposeless event. I find the gospel for today haunting. Just as I found that afternoon haunting. It's the evening. And the doors are closed for fear. John insists on saying fear of the Jews, but of course the young Christian community is still battling it out with their Jewish neighbors, their brothers and sisters. So we can eliminate that word. We can just say the doors were closed for fear. Certainly for that group, having heard that Jesus is risen in the morning, they are still afraid. The door is bolted shut because they're afraid of arrest. They're afraid of being interrogated. Perhaps they're afraid because they've lost their leader and they are now feeling purposeless. There is no meaning. We can imagine their fear because as we gather here this morning, we come with our own fears. Perhaps it's the fear over a child who's in trouble, who seems not to be able to be reached. The fear that comes from a job that's not going well, the fear of aging, the fear of not being old enough yet to do what I want to do. Many kinds of fears that claim us over and over again. Into that room that evening and to this room this morning, Jesus enters. And he does the one thing that I would think would not allay fear. He shows his wounds. Don't you think that's odd? I've always thought that was odd. Jesus enters the room and shows his wounds. Commentators tell us that it was a matter of identity. He wanted to make sure they knew that it really was the Jesus who was crucified. He really had died, and now he was living. God had raised Jesus from the dead. And that's all well and good, but I think there's more. I think Jesus, in showing them his wounds, having to stretch out those hands yet again, invites them into their purpose, their meaning, and their ministry. Invites them into their true life. And their true life, just as our true life, is to hold our arms, our hands outstretched, which means we're vulnerable, which means we are not self-protecting. To hold our hands outstretched in love. After he shows them those wounds, we're told, and again, it seems to me almost incredulous, they rejoiced. Could it be that in that moment they really began to get it? But the rejoicing can't last so long that Jesus doesn't say to them, peace. These wounds come with peace. I am not angry. God is not angry. Peace to you. He breathes on them and into them. He gives them that ruach, that spirit, that breath of creation, recreating them anew. And he sends them out. To be his disciples, to be the church, means we have to leave the building and take that ruach, that wounded love, into the world, into the lives of those we know, but also into the lives of those we don't know, and perhaps even to those we're afraid of. Let me return to the cloisters. I think the Romanesque cross is one of the most beautiful there is. I'm fond of several versions of crosses, even the tortured Jesus of South American art. But this particular cross, I think, conveys the message, the meaning of this day. In the Romanesque cross, Jesus is gowned as a king, and often in those crosses he's wearing a crown. His eyes may be open, but his eyes may also be closed, and the expression is sweet. So it's not the tortured Christ, which can be appropriate at any number of other times, but it's this Christ in peace. The wounds are evident, but he's in peace. And when I was in that chapel at the cloisters and watched those young people with their eyes mostly closed, I was wondering, and I was thinking to myself, oh, open your eyes, please look up. Can't you see he's not angry? He's not that fearful Jesus that you've heard about or read about. He is not the son of an angry God. He's the son of the God who suffers with us and for us and then invites us into a new life which involves letting down our armor, taking it off, opening our arms and our hearts to each other and the world in that suffering love, a love that's willing to give up. Whatever the give up is in anyone's particular life or a community's particular life is willing to give up and be. Open your eyes. I've been thinking about that scene ever since, and it strikes me maybe that's our mission, our ministry, is to keep finding new and creative and life-giving ways to reach out to generations of people of any age who don't yet know that God is not angry, that God is love, that Christ is the human face of God, and the Spirit we celebrate today is the great animator of life who gives us the power and the courage and the ability to be that love in the world. The love that lays down its life. I've often thought in the various parishes I've served that we often think we come together on Sunday because we're like-minded, because we like each other, because we have enough in common, we have many interests. Coffee hour can go on for hours, and that's a grand thing. But that's not the reason we gather. We could have nothing in common. We could be on opposite ends of the political and the social poles of our existence. It doesn't matter. Christ gathers us together. Christ calls us together and gives us a purpose and a meaning that we live our whole life long, that this community and every Christian community is invited to live its whole life long. Our unity is found in the arms, open and loving. And like children, we're invited to look up and mimic. We see Christ open and loving, and the invitation for us is to open our arms. We can tame it as much as we want. We can do everything we can to denude it of meaning and purpose. But the reason why this day is so important is because the gift of the Holy Spirit will not allow us to. We're really not in control. And so here's a poem by the incomparable poet Cheryl Lawrie, Lawrie, if you don't know her work. It's called Come to Think of It. Come to think of it, actually, your spirit is not really like a flickering candle sitting on the altar, which we've protected from scorching and a heat-proof mat. You burn with irrepressible, ferocious passion. In truth, your spirit has little in common with the gentle breeze from the fan fluttering the bulletins as it rotates from the front pews during the children's talk. We can barely stand upright in the face of your love. Luckily, your spirit barely resembles a helium-filled red balloon rising just out of reach to taunt us as it rests against the church ceiling. You would subsume us in the unrelenting hold of your peace. We think we have nailed you in our fire-resistant, cyclone-proof, red cloth swathed metaphors. Thank God, our inadequacy defining you has never stopped you yet. Thank God, our inadequacy defining God, defining God's Son and defining God's Spirit, that Holy Trinity, has never stopped that Spirit, that Trinity, yet. Amen.